Every town hides secrets, but some villages bury them alive. St. Mary Me was one such place, where every smile masked a story, and every prayer carried a whisper of fear. When an old silver spoon long forgotten beneath the soil resurfaced, it wasn't just an object, it was a silent witness, a buried confession, a pathway to a chilling truth. And Miss Marple, with her quiet gaze and sharper mind, didn't just uncover it, she listened to it. But the real question remains, are all truths meant to be found, or are some secrets better left in the dark? It was a deceptively tranquil spring afternoon in the secluded village of Elmridge Hollow, the kind of day when time itself seemed to pause, when sunlight fell like gold dust over the ivy-covered rooftops, birds chirped in rhythms too perfect to be coincidence, and the fragrance of chamomile, lavender, and freshly turned earth mingled in the breeze like a forgotten lullaby. The air carried a curious stillness, not silence, but an almost watchful calm, as though the village were holding its breath. Inside the old stone rectory nestled at the edge of the wood, the drawing room glowed with a warm amber light that filtered gently through faded lace curtains, casting dappled shadows on the floral rug and oil paintings that had hung untouched for generations. The grandfather clock marked each second with an elegant tick that echoed softly against the hush, a metronome to the peculiar peace that settled over the room. In her usual high-backed chair near the window, Miss Eleanor Whitmore sat with a calm grace that belied the razor-sharp mind behind her composed exterior. Draped in a pale shawl and clutching a teacup in fragile fingers, she stirred with slow precision, her movements as methodical as her thoughts. Her gaze, though soft, held an alertness, not of suspicion, but of endless quiet calculations, always watching, always listening. Across from her, Reverend Halbridge spoke in a tone that fluctuated between theological musings and local gossip, recounting the curious events of the past week, while his wife Clara, sharp-eyed, silver-haired and uncommonly perceptive, sat stitching a rose pattern into a length of linen, glancing up only when her husband's words took an odd turn. Tucked right between the pages of a dusty old edition of Paradise Lost, the Reverend said with a trace of unease, a single silver teaspoon bent, no, twisted almost artistically, like a ribbon of metal shaped by hand. And that's not the strangest part. It was polished, gleaming in fact, as if it had been placed there moments before I found it. Miss Whitmore's hand paused mid-stir, her eyes narrowing just slightly, the only hint of the gears now turning rapidly in her mind. Twisted, she repeated, her tone light but layered. Not by accident, the Reverend confirmed, nodding solemnly. The rest of the book was coated in dust, the pages stiff with age, but the spoon shiny, warm to the touch. It was as though it had waited there deliberately, knowing someone would come. And where exactly was this discovered? Miss Whitmore asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be ordinary. Among Mrs. Faircroft's belongings, Halbridge replied. She passed quietly in her sleep. No signs of struggle, no immediate family. Her solicitor asked for assistance in sorting through her personal library. She had a fondness for antique books, many in Latin, Greek, even Old Church Slavonic. But this particular volume was shelved alone, not among her usual catalogued sets. Clara frowned thoughtfully, her needle paused mid-thread. Odd place to hide something like a spoon. Quite, said the Reverend. And there was something engraved along the stem, Latin. I think, though the script was faint. Miss Whitmore said nothing at first. She gently set down her cup and leaned back slightly, eyes unfocused but far from idle. Mrs. Faircroft, she murmured. A widow for nearly 20 years, rarely seen beyond the edge of her garden. No visitors, no trips, no town appearances, yet always punctual with her donations to the church and her book club subscriptions. Clara nodded slowly. People said she was hiding a heartbreak. There were rumors of a family rift, a brother, I believe. Elijah Faircroft, said the Reverend, vanished without explanation nearly 30 years ago. No note, no goodbye. His name was whispered, then forgotten, until now. Miss Whitmore's brow furrowed ever so slightly. And the spoon, it was warm, you say? Yes, Strangely so, Halbridge answered, almost reluctantly. It struck me after I left the house. The dust on the shelves, the sealed windows, and yet that spoon was untouched by time. It gleamed like something that didn't belong. An uneasy silence followed. Miss Whitmore stood, slowly approaching the window, her fingers brushing against the cold glass as she peered into the fading sunlight. She did not see the rectory garden. She saw an overgrown estate, a shadowed study with shelves that groaned under the weight of secrets, and a single volume opened not by curiosity, but by memory. The kind of memory that wounds more than it heals. A twisted spoon, a hidden message, a name buried beneath dust and shame. This was no random hiding place, she said finally, her voice low, each word deliberate. This was a sign, an object folded by emotion, fear perhaps, or guilt, hidden not out of madness, but purpose. Clara's stitching resumed, slowly now, while the Reverend watched Miss Whitmore with a look of wary anticipation. He had seen this before, that stillness in her posture that came just before revelation, the moment when every detail began aligning into a picture only she could see. The Latin, Miss Whitmore murmured, half to herself, would tell us more, and the fact that it was placed recently, well, it means someone else has access to that house, or never truly left it. Her voice trailed off, but her expression was firm, as though she'd just pulled a thread that would unravel something long buried. Objects don't hide themselves, she said, almost whispering. They are placed by those with something to remember, or something to forget. Then, in a tone so soft, it was almost lost in the tick of the clock, she added, people hide things in plain sight, when the weight of a buried truth grows too heavy to carry. And sometimes, what is hidden is not meant to be discovered, but to be understood. The old house on the edge of Graven Hollow had stood silent for decades, its windows like clouded eyes, watching the world pass without blinking. But when Eleanor Whitmore's name appeared in the obituary column, the village felt a subtle shiver, as though the ground remembered something it wasn't ready to recall. Not long after, strange symbols, etched faintly into stone benches, and carved subtly into the wood of her study desk, began to surface, prompting only those attuned to old secrets to take notice. Some messages, murmured Adelaide Breyer, brushing dust from a yellowing Latin volume tucked behind a row of false spines, are meant not to be read but recognized. She was no stranger to symbols that outlived their authors. The bent spoon, engraved with an obscure passage from Via Virtutis, was no trinket. It was a cipher, a whisper left behind by Eleanor for someone with eyes unclouded by convention. Father Mallory, once convinced that evil only belonged in fairy tales and confessionals, now found his gaze drawn repeatedly to the shadows of the rectory, where dust motes danced like restless souls and silence hummed with questions. She was alone too long, he offered, half-heartedly. Solitude plays tricks. Adelaide gave a gentle knowing smile but said nothing. Her thoughts had already drifted to the study shelves, where one book had recently been disturbed, its dust subtly shifted by a hand that was not the vicar's. Someone came, she whispered later, and they weren't searching for a story, they were searching for what the story hides. When Nathaniel Gray arrived, well-dressed, soft-voiced, claiming blood ties to Eleanor and bearing a sealed letter dated barely weeks before her passing, the village responded with restrained politeness, masking the collective tightening of breath. His presence was disarmingly poised, his claims reasonable, and yet Adelaide noticed the paper of his letter, no fading, no crease, too perfect for something meant to be forgotten and suddenly remembered. Within days, he walked the gardens with deliberate grace, speaking fondly of memories he couldn't have known, and family traits he couldn't have inherited. He told tales at the vicarage over sponge cake and weak tea, tales that sounded polished, too polished. He laughed on cue, spoke with warmth, and yet never once let his eyes rest, always scanning, always measuring. Adelaide watched him with calm patience, noting the way his fingers lingered over Eleanor's old desk longer than necessary, how he glanced toward the cellar door when no one else was looking, how the soft rustle of pages seemed to draw him more than the words themselves. Whatever he was searching for, it wasn't inheritance, it was something buried, something Eleanor had hidden behind riddles and relics, and something that now awakened was beginning to stir beneath the quiet floorboards of Graven Hollow. It was a morning softened by last night's rain, a hush in the air that made even the birdsong feel cautious, as Lady Beatrice Allerton sat in the dim corner of the manor library, and opened a worn leather-bound diary, its pages fragile with time, its ink nearly faded but pulsing with secrets that had refused to die. The very first line she read stopped her breath. What has been buried never stays silent. The truth does not rot with the dead. At first, she brushed it off as poetic exaggeration, but something about those words lingered, like the taste of metal before a storm. No one in the village of Darnley Hollow suspected that the grand Allerton estate, with its ivy-laced balconies and sun-starved gardens, held anything more than history. But beneath the centuries-old timber and oil paintings, lay a silence heavy with something unspoken, something waiting. That was precisely when he arrived, Jonathan Gray, a quiet man with polite manners and an old-world accent, claiming distant kinship with Lady Beatrice, yet something in his demeanor was off. He moved through the manor, not like a guest, but like a shadow returning home, his eyes pausing just a second too long on portraits, floorboards and fixtures, as though mapping memories rather than admiring decor. The townsfolk, wary by nature, watched him with the kind of curiosity reserved for traveling magicians or fire-eaters at autumn fairs, but no one watched him as closely as Miss Arabella Quinn, sharp-eyed, discreet, and as essential to the village as the clock tower's chime. Arabella had long been the quiet keeper of Darnley Hollow's whispered truths, and her instincts rarely failed her. She noticed how Jonathan often drifted toward the forgotten parts of the manor, the sunroom with its cracked tiles and the derelict west garden, where the statue of Eros stood chipped and moss-covered. Every day, she observed him loitering there with odd items, a faded blueprint, a rusted compass, sometimes just a gloved hand brushing against the earth. But he wasn't admiring the dying roses, or the withered hedges. No, his eyes were fixed on the ground itself, as if it might answer a question no one else dared ask. One afternoon, Arabella, under the pretense of delivering lacework to Lady Beatrice, caught Jonathan crouched near the statue, his fingers gently scraping the soil, not digging, not planting, but tracing something unseen. Later that night, a scream broke the stillness of the manor. Lady Beatrice was found collapsed in her study, the diary clenched in her trembling hands, its final page torn halfway through. Her eyes, usually steely with aristocratic calm, now shimmered with dread, and by dawn, the estate's longtime caretaker, Mr. Giles, was missing without a trace. Panic began to stir in the village. The next morning, beneath the statue in the west garden, a small silver bracelet was unearthed by a groundskeeper. Inside its locket, a tiny photo, an unfamiliar young woman, and a boy with a knowing smile, a smile that echoed Jonathan Gray's all too eerily. Arabella's heart quickened. This wasn't just inheritance, this was blood, this was betrayal, this was history resurfacing in the most calculated of ways. Why had Jonathan come now? Why here? What did he already know? And what was he still hiding? That evening, the manor's library was found empty. Jonathan gone. No luggage, no farewell, only his rusted compass was left on the desk, its needle spinning endlessly, refusing to point north. The diary's torn page had been mysteriously restored, and upon it, a single chilling line now stood where before there had been only empty parchment. The earth forgets nothing. What it holds, it guards, until it's ready to be seen again. Arabella stood by the window, the dying light of dusk glinting off her spectacles as she gazed out at the west garden. The soil near the statue was uneven again, the moss freshly disturbed, and just beside it, a single footprint, half faded, leading nowhere, or perhaps, leading deeper into a mystery that had only just begun. The news of Harold Kenwick's sudden passing spread with the kind of whisper that travels faster than sound, low, heavy, and curiously absent of shock. Miss Elowen Hartley, who had once shared a chess match, and a sharp exchange of words with the man over tea, made no remark upon hearing it. But deep within her sharp, composed mind, an old scene reassembled itself with chilling precision. A cryptic remark about debts unpaid, a bent silver spoon slipped between the pages of a law journal, a young man with a story too clean to be trusted, and a letter, thick, wax-sealed, carried by Harold into his study, the very night he died. Officially, it was ruled an unfortunate misstep, an overworked man tumbling down a narrow staircase late at night, surrounded by strewn papers, a toppled chair, and a broken oil lamp. But Elowen, with her hawk's eye for disorder masquerading as chance, saw through the ruse. The ink blot hadn't burst, it had bled, a quiet arc, deliberate, pooling rather than splattering, as if the bottle had been tilted by intent, not panic. The lamp's glass remained intact despite the claimed fall, and a faint trace of something viscous oil perhaps lingered along the banister, precisely where a hand might have gripped not in accident, but control. She said nothing, for truth she believed, crept in quietly, like a shadow slinking between doorways, never needing to shout. The next day, under the guise of returning a misplaced botanical volume, she visited Harold's housekeeper, Mrs. Faulkner, a stiff-backed woman with lips pressed as tightly as her apron strings. In hushed tones, Mrs. Faulkner confessed she'd heard a sound the night of his death, a door's creak, unmistakable in that old house where wood spoke like memory, and from her attic window, she'd seen a figure in a charcoal coat, moving swiftly through the garden, head bowed, slipping through the hedgerow instead of the gate. Not a friend, not a visitor, someone with purpose, someone unseen. Elowen didn't press, she never needed to. Later, speaking with Harold's clerk, a pale nervy youth named Adrian Murrin, she learned of the letter, delivered that afternoon, sealed in thick crimson wax, the kind used not for business but for secrets. Harold had read it alone, frowned, then pocketed it. By morning, it had vanished, leaving behind only shattered spectacles and a brass key with no known lock. No one could explain the letter's absence. It hadn't been filed, or logged, or even acknowledged to the constable. A man who dies by accident has no reason to hide correspondence, but a man who has been cornered, threatened or confronted might. Elowen's thoughts settled on the missing letter as the heart of it all, message, motive, or warning erased by a hand that feared what it revealed. And fear, she knew, rarely walked alone. Fear brought silence, fear brought careful lies. And in Harold Kenwick's silent fall, in the too neat wreckage and the vanishing ink, fear had worn shoes soft enough to leave no print, only questions, rising now like smoke through a locked room, waiting to be seen. The invitation had arrived on crisp cream stationery, polite, unobtrusive, and precisely the sort Miss Thorne never ignored. That Sunday, beneath skies too pale to promise warmth, she arrived at Hawthorne Hollow, the ancestral seat of the Marchmont family, a place whose corridors still whispered of old wars and older debts. Elliot Marchmont, urbane and unfailingly courteous, received her with the expected ceremony, tea served in bone china, the air laced with bergamot and civility. But her eyes drifted not to the conversation, but to the gleaming array of cutlery, placed with deliberate care on the sideboard. Among them, one teaspoon almost unremarkable, save for a subtle indentation at the neck, and an engraving just faint enough to pretend obscurity, seized her interest. Its pattern was unmistakable, a twin to a spoon once shown to her by a trembling young maid, who had kept it wrapped in flannel behind a floorboard, swearing it belonged to someone long buried in the family history. Yet here it was again, polished and defiant, no longer bent, as though someone had taken time to reshape, not just silver, but memory. Mr. Marchmont noted her gaze with a smile that lasted a second too long, and offered that the family silver had recently been lovingly restored. Miss Thorne nodded, her smile as smooth as clotted cream, but her thoughts ran deeper. She excused herself to admire the view from the orangery, and in her quiet path around the manor, she noted another detail, a cutlery case with one space subtly empty, its velvet cradle compressed by long absence, not a spoon recently used, but one recently removed. Later, in the garden under pretense of examining the lavender beds, she spoke with Mrs. Percival, a companion of the late Lady Marchmont, a woman who wore pearls like they were pennants. In a voice worn by time and port, Mrs. Percival mentioned, as if recalling a half-remembered dream, that the late lady had once confessed to hiding away what never should have been found, a line that made Miss Thorne's pulse still for just a breath. 2 days later, With the Marchmont household occupied by town errands and the groundskeeper too deaf to mind, Miss Thorne returned, not as a guest, but as a seeker. She moved with the quiet authority of a woman, accustomed to the spaces others avoid. Behind the crumbling stone sundial, where moss had grown unnaturally thick, her gloved hands dug patiently until her fingers brushed metal, cold, stubborn and waiting. She unearthed a spoon, older and heavier than the one at tea, its bowl etched with initials and a date, July 3, 1898. She wrapped it carefully in her linen kerchief, knowing this was no mere utensil, but a relic tied to lineage, legacy, or lies, perhaps all three. The weight of it was not silver, but secret. By the week's end, Miss Thorne requested access to the attic under the gentle ruse of historical curiosity, and no one objected. Why would they? She was harmless after all. But as the narrow stairs groaned beneath her step, and the air thickened with forgotten dust, she knew the past had not gone quietly. It had only learned to hide in corners. The attic was a landscape of trunks and torn drapes, of photograph albums with faces scratched out and ledgers with torn pages. In the farthest corner, beneath a moth-eaten quilt and a toppled parasol, she discovered a chest with a single tarnished lock, and inside, papers, brittle with age, but potent in implication, birth records that didn't match, letters never sent, and a final missive signed with the same initials engraved on the buried spoon. Miss Thorne stood motionless for a long moment, the paper trembling ever so slightly between her fingers. This house, this family, it had not simply forgotten. It had rearranged its past, polished it, erased the bends in its history, and placed it on display. But silver remembers, and soil, and silence, and now so did she. Miss Marple moved with the solemn grace of someone long acquainted with secrets time had tried to bury, her gloved fingertips ghosting over forgotten remnants of lives once lived fully, and now reduced to whispers beneath dust and shadow, until in a corner of the Hawthorne estate's attic, tucked beneath an unremarkable length of moth-eaten tapestry, and flanked by rusted trunks of faded grandeur, she discovered an old crate, pushed deep into the wall, as though the house itself had tried to forget it. The lid groaned open with a reluctant creak, and within it lay a velvet pouch, wrapped in a sampler stitched with initials too delicately sewn to be casual. C.W. The same letters Miss Marple had glimpsed scrawled hurriedly in the 1899 parish register, beside a name that had been crossed out, then overwritten, and finally marked confidential, in red ink by a nervous curate. Her breath caught as she opened the pouch to reveal a locket, oval gold warm despite the chill in the air, and inside, a painted miniature of a teenage girl, whose eyes burned with the same uncanny intensity as Arthur Kingsley's, the newly arrived heir, who had won over the village with charm, but whose lineage had always seemed too carefully curated. And yet it was not the face that shook Miss Marple, it was the inscription curled like a whisper around the inner rim of the locket, to E.H., forever mine, C.W., which matched the signature on a sealed letter hidden in a false bottom of the crate. One Miss Marple, uncovered with the careful edge of her trowel, revealing a bundle of yellowing pages, bound not by thread, but by dread, their wax seals still intact, each marked with years that traced the timeline of a quiet tragedy. The topmost envelope addressed, "To be opened if they dare rewrite me." The letter within told not of theft, but of manipulation. A girl cast out under the pretense of shame to cover for her brother's secret dealings with the solicitor, who had rewritten the Hawthorne will the very day the original heir mysteriously fell from his horse, his death ruled accidental, though the saddle straps had clearly been tampered with, a fact whispered by stable hands and then silenced with sudden promotions. As the letter unfolded, line after line bled truth, naming no one outright, yet threading a tapestry of betrayal concealed maternity, and heirlooms melted down not by a thief, but by a grieving sister who had repurposed the silver into communion pieces for the village church. Items that Miss Marple now recalled had borne an odd engraving, a single date, the 14th of October 1901, the day the girl was said to have disappeared, when in truth she had been sent away to give birth in secret, never to return. The pieces had sat polished on the altar every Sunday, part of the sacred, hiding the profane in plain sight, and now, as Miss Marple stood amid relics that groaned beneath the weight of everything unsaid. She understood. Arthur Kingsley was not who he pretended to be, not the clean air of a respectable bloodline, but the consequence of a truth buried beneath generations of silence and shame. And someone still alive, had gone to great lengths to ensure he never learned who he truly was. For every hidden crate, every turned portrait, every reshaped heirloom, was not the act of forgetting, but of mourning, of quiet rebellion against the erasure of a child born out of scandal, yet loved in silence. And as the wind stirred the attic's stale air, Miss Marple knew she stood, not in a room of artifacts, but at the crossroads of a legacy that had twisted itself into lies to preserve its face. And the moment the truth would be spoken aloud, the walls themselves might groan from the burden they'd carried for over 40 years. Nathaniel's arrival in Greystone Hollow felt less like coincidence and more like destiny dressed in modest tweed. An echo of something long forgotten pulling itself back into existence. The way he walked through the ivy-shadowed corridors of the old Claiborne estate suggested not curiosity, but memory, steps rehearsed in dreams passed down through blood. And when he appeared at the solicitor's door just days after the last Claiborne matriarch had been laid to rest, it wasn't grief in his eyes, it was recognition, as if the house had whispered his name for decades, waiting to be heard again. Yet truth rarely returns without resistance, and Miss Orlowen Reed, who had been the village's silent archivist for nearly 40 years, felt a shiver of unease when his name appeared in her morning correspondence, scribbled hastily beneath a broken wax seal stamped with a family crest, long thought extinct. Her instincts led her first to Maud Whitcomb, once the Claiborne's housemaid, and now a frail but sharp-minded recluse in a cottage lined with dried herbs and dust-faded lace, over black tea steeped too long, and the slow ticking of a crooked grandfather clock. Maud spoke hesitantly of the day the silver vanished from the east wing, the same day Master Lionel was found at the lake's edge with a bruised temple, and a note in his pocket, that no one had dared to read aloud. She remembered Lady Claiborne sobbing behind closed doors, whispering to the butler to send him away before the others asked questions, and how the boy, Lionel's cousin, had left without protest, his gaze not one of shame but quiet resolution, like a soldier falling on a sword not his own. Miss Reed listened with stillness, the edges of a darker truth threading together in her mind, not a theft, but a sacrifice. And just as the pieces began to align, word came that Edith Glass, the family's former governess and the last person to see Lionel alive, had died unexpectedly, peacefully in her sleep, they said, though the apothecary's apprentice noted an odd bitter scent in the teacup by her bedside, and the coroner, young and unsure, dismissed it as irrelevant. Miss Reed, however, remembered her last visit with Edith, how the woman clutched a weathered diary to her chest and muttered, "Some stories burn if left too long in shadow." She had promised to hand it over, pages filled with secrets scrawled during lonely nights when she alone had witnessed what unfolded behind the estate's shuttered windows. But after her death, the diary vanished, replaced only by a single charred scrap found in the fireplace, half a sentence left to haunt the air. "He didn't jump. He was pushed." Now, in the quiet that followed, Miss Reed knew this wasn't merely about inheritance or forgotten bloodlines. It was about a wound stitched shut with silence, now reopening at the worst possible time, and someone still watching from behind curtains and crumbling portraits, was willing to kill again to ensure the truth never walked through the front door. The silence on Elderbridge Lane that day was unusually heavy, as if even the wind had sensed a buried secret, and decided to hold its breath. Miss Helena Whitmore sat alone in her old study room, when an aged yellowing envelope slid silently beneath her door, unmarked, sealed only with a red wax crest bearing the initials R in an old trembling script, the kind that seemed to have been touched by time, but not erased by it. Inside was just one thing, a Queen of Spades playing card, its edges stained with something dark and greasy, whether ink or blood, it was hard to tell, and an old photograph of 3 young girls, smiling under the wisteria-covered veranda of Briarwood Hall, but one of the faces had been violently scraped out, as if someone had tried not just to forget, but to erase that person entirely from the story. Miss Whitmore didn't hesitate. She summoned Miss Marple, whom she had always considered just an intelligent retiree, but whose mind could slip into shadows where others dared not tread. Miss Marple took the envelope in hand, stared at the Queen of Spades, and said only, "This isn't a game, it's a sentence." That very night, a fire broke out in the long-abandoned greenhouse at Briarwood Hall, a crumbling structure full of dust, withered plants, and half-buried memories. When the fire was finally doused, the fireman found a charred notebook amidst the ash, its cover reduced to soot, but its pages somehow intact. Inside were frantic notes, scattered thoughts, and one line written over and over in the familiar, flowing hand of Caroline Redwin, "The wrong one paid." To Miss Marple that was a clear sign. Someone had suffered a punishment meant for another, and the real culprit was still walking free. Days later, the village stirred with gossip when Julian Redwin, Caroline's brother, long absent in Europe for over 30 years, suddenly returned under the pretense of settling the estate. But there was a strange unsettling recognition in his eyes, not just of the ruins, but of debts long left unpaid. Miss Marple quietly visited Briarwood Hall, where she discovered a drawer left open in the old drawing-room's bookshelf. Hidden between faded waltz music sheets was a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, Caroline's letters. The last one read, "If you don't stop it, the truth will surface, and when truth rises from the earth, it only leaves corpses behind." That letter had been written just 2 days before Caroline vanished. Old Darby, the estate gardener now retired, told Miss Marple that on the night after Caroline disappeared, he heard laughter behind the greenhouse. But she wasn't crying. She was laughing, softly, madly. That's when Miss Marple knew this wasn't a simple disappearance. This was a story rewritten like a deck of cards, where the Queen hid a king behind her. When more torn pages of Caroline's diary surfaced in the village's ancient vicarage, the mystery only deepened. One entry read, "Julian saw me, but said nothing, because he had a secret too, and letting me live meant risking it." Miss Marple now understood, this wasn't about guilt alone, it was about inheritance. A legacy of sins where everyone had hidden something beneath the soil, behind a photograph, or within themselves. And when Miss Marple found another Queen of Spades in Julian's old study, this time pinned beneath a small ornate dagger, she called the police without a word. Some truths are buried, yes, but when the ground itself begins to speak, it doesn't whisper, it screams. And Miss Marple knew this well. Those who believe time fades all things forget that guilt does not blur with time, it deepens. And when it resurfaces, it doesn't just bring proof, it brings punishment. Beneath the shadow of time, a story once buried in silence began to stir, not with noise but with the quiet weight of long-suppressed truth. It was never meant to be spoken aloud, at least not by the one who lived it. Inside the aging library of Cramley Manor, nestled between crumbling volumes and forgotten dust, a peculiar silver spoon, deliberately bent, rested within the hollowed pages of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, its presence too precise to be accidental. This was no childish hiding place, no misplaced heirloom, it was a monument shaped by guilt. Not the kind of guilt born from malice, but the haunting kind, subtle, corrosive and long-lived. Mrs. Eleanora Havisham had, years ago, watched her brother Alaric fall into ruin. She had not raised her voice in his defense, whether out of fear, social pressure, or some deeper wound she never named. She had let him walk into disgrace alone, and in doing so, chained herself to a silence that echoed through every passing year. The bent spoon was her confession, wordless yet undeniable. Placed inside an allegory of struggle and redemption, it was not a keepsake, it was a gravestone for a brother never truly mourned, for a love never spoken, for justice never pursued. Miss Alira March, the elderly woman, the village knew simply as that clever spinster, had eyes not just for facts, but for the faint footprints left behind by buried emotion. She did not see the spoon as mere silver, nor the book as merely literature. She saw a code, etched not in ink, but in sorrow. And then came Nathaniel, quiet, almost spectral in his presence, stepping into the manor garden not like a visitor, but like a man returning to a chapter he never finished reading. In his hands he held a small wooden box, dark with age, smoothed at the corners by time and trembling fingers. He said nothing as he approached Miss March, simply nodded once with solemn understanding, and held the box out, not offering, not insisting, just presenting a truth waiting to be faced. She did not open it. Not yet, because she knew that what lay inside wasn't just an object. It was a catalyst. Later, with the calm certainty of someone who has solved not just a mystery but a human tragedy, Miss March orchestrated a quiet gathering. No spectacle, no grand confrontation, just carefully placed whispers and notes, a word to the vicar, a subtle prompt to the constable, a discreet invitation to the solicitor, and summons to a few whose lives intersected with the events of long ago. In the softly lit drawing room of the manor, those summoned sat in curiosity, confusion, and quiet dread. There was Nathaniel, guarded yet restless. Barl Appleton, the aging housekeeper who'd long suspected more than she ever said. Mr. Lowry, the former assistant whose pale features spoke volumes, and Sergeant Blackwood, present under the guise of finalizing paperwork, but fully aware he had walked into something deeper. Miss March didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Her words were soft, measured, almost domestic in tone, but each syllable carried the gravity of truth peeling away years of deception. She spoke of the silver spoons, not hidden for value, but bent with purpose, placed like markers in a private cemetery of memory. She spoke of the date etched into stone, the face in a faded portrait that matched the man too closely for comfort. She pointed not to motives, but to emotions, the kind that linger, fester, and eventually demand release. She explained how Mrs. Havisham had not been wicked, but wounded. That she had allowed her brother's name to be stained, not because she wanted to see him fall, but because she did not know how to stop it. And that guilt, unlike regret, does not fade. It evolves, it reshapes a person, it bends spoons, it tucks away tokens in sacred texts. It locks away confessions in wooden boxes, hoping someone might someday understand. As her voice threaded through the room, something intangible shifted, as if the very air had grown heavy with revelation. No accusations were made, yet no denials were offered. The silence afterward wasn't awkward, it was sacred. Everyone present knew, in some quiet part of themselves, that they had just witnessed not the solving of a crime, but the release of a soul. A reckoning not with law, but with loss. This was never just about a hidden object. It was about grief, unspoken, unresolved, and ultimately unbearable. Miss March had not exposed a scandal. She had liberated a truth, and in doing so, she reminded everyone present that some of the deepest wounds are inflicted not by cruelty, but by silence. And those are the wounds that time alone cannot heal. In the withering silence of a manor, long haunted by its genteel façade and rotting secrets, the truth had not perished. It had calcified, preserved like a relic, behind layers of generational pride and willful amnesia, until one object, a bent silver spoon nestled deliberately between the time-worn pages of the Pilgrim's Progress, began to unravel the tightly woven lies of a once revered family name. This was no mere utensil forgotten in haste, it was a relic of remorse, shaped by hands that trembled with memory and guilt, a confession not inked in diaries or proclaimed in court, but quietly molded in alloy, by a woman whose silence had once condemned an innocent man. Miss Audric Vale, whose steady voice now filled the room where doubt once reigned, held it aloft, not as evidence of theft, but as a deeply buried apology, forged in shame and preserved in sorrow. Each dent a muted echo of the justice denied to Edward Langston, the man who had suffered a quiet ruin while the world went on pretending virtue. Each spoon, she revealed, had been a silent requiem, a token of atonement not meant to exonerate, but to remember, to ache, to bleed in the shadows of a legacy wrapped in fine linen and whispered scandals. The act of placing the spoon inside the Pilgrim's Progress, a book that chronicled the weight of sin, the hardship of redemption, and the treacherous journey of salvation, was no careless accident, but a deliberate metaphor. A symbolic burial of guilt inside a text that understood penitence more intimately than the family ever had. The truth Miss Vale had uncovered through months of hushed inquiries, long-forgotten letters, crumbling legal documents, and one haunting absence in the Whitmere estate records, pointed not to Edward, but to Gregory Whitmere himself, the patriarch whose legacy had been built on charm and deceit, and whose sudden mysterious death, once ruled an accident, now reeked of fear. Fear that the truth he buried would surface, fear that the sins he coated in wealth and hospitality would finally breathe. Edward had discovered this long ago, yet remained silent, bound by either a sense of futile loyalty, or the paralyzing realization that the rich seldom faced the punishment their sins deserved. But Elspeth Whitmere had known too, perhaps not from the beginning, but certainly long enough to have acted, and yet she chose silence, retreating into her grief, her shame, her slow, solitary descent into moral exile, marking every regret with a bent spoon, as if trying to exhume her soul from the past, one buried truth at a time. Her remorse had not been loud. It had lived in glances, in the weight of unspoken words, in the eerie reverence with which she preserved those spoons, not hidden to erase, but placed where the right eyes might eventually find them. Miss Vale's fingers gripped the cold, contorted silver as though it pulsed with memory, and in that moment, the room shifted. The burden, once unfairly placed on Edward's shoulders, now crushed down upon the conscience of the living. And in the midst of this reckoning stood Elias Grayson, the man many had eyed with suspicion when he first arrived in the village, a figure with polished manners and inquisitive eyes, claiming distant kinship and an unclear inheritance. As Miss Vale observed him more closely, she saw no greed, only ache, no cunning, only quiet desperation. His late-night walks through the overgrown garden, his lingering gaze upon portraits and heirlooms, his almost reverent attention to Elspeth's belongings, all pointed not to a man seeking wealth, but to one searching for identity, for belonging, for some thread of truth he could follow back to a name, scrubbed from family records and choked in silence. He was not a fortune hunter but a seeker of bloodlines, of memory, of a history denied to him through deliberate omission and genteel deceit. His presence was the final stroke of irony. The very lineage Elspeth tried to atone for was walking her halls again, not to punish, but to reclaim what had been stripped from Edward, and in doing so from him. And as thunder growled low across the skies outside, and rain began to streak the glass in slow mournful patterns, Miss Vale let the silence hang. She didn't need to name the guilty or speak of justice in legal terms, for the bent spoon had done all the speaking. It was no longer a piece of evidence, but an artifact of truth, of sorrow, of long-suppressed humanity. The air grew heavier, not from fear, but from the strange peace that follows a storm of secrets finally breaking. Redemption, it seemed, had not come through vengeance or law, but through a single act of acknowledgement, wrapped in silver and remorse, resting quietly inside a book that had always known the way back from sin. In the fog-drenched village of Ashcroft Hollow, where the ivy-choked manors whispered of old sins and forgotten bloodlines, it wasn't wealth that drew Julian Merton back to his ancestral land. It was a name, a shadowed memory, and the ache of silence long endured. For years, rumors had clung to the Merton name like mold to a crypt, rumors of betrayal, of a scandal that had shattered reputations and left his grandfather Elias Merton branded a thief, and cast out without defense or dignity. But Julian hadn't returned to inherit an estate. He came to exhume the truth from the ruins of whispered lies, and Miss Evelyn Hart, sharp-eyed and serenely methodical, watched it all unfold with quiet precision, sensing from the moment Julian crossed the threshold of Greystone Hall, that the boy bore more than questions. He carried the weight of vindication in his bones. She had seen this unravel before. The local solicitor, Mr. Bartholomew Vexley, revered for his courteous restraint, had spent decades shielding the village from disgrace, yet beneath that carefully practiced calm, festered a man tormented by lineage, and a growing desperation to protect a legacy steeped in deceit. As Julian delved deeper into parish records and weathered testimonies, Evelyn sensed the inevitable. Vexley, fearing the unmasking of his father's sins, would act not out of reason, but instinct, and instinct can turn even the most civil men savage. His father's theft, the wrongful accusation against Elias, the hush money, the vanished ledger, all pointed back to Vexley Sr., and the younger Vexley could see it all slipping through his fingers. So when Julian arrived at his office, that rainy October evening, it wasn't dialogue he sought, but confrontation, and it ended not in resolution, but calamity, a spilled cup, a sudden shove, a cracked skull against the mahogany desk, and silence, horrid, suffocating silence. Vexley's death was ruled accidental, but Miss Hart knew better. She had seen the terror in Julian's eyes, not of guilt, but of the realization that the truth had finally demanded its price. Yet there was more, always more. The sudden passing of Marjorie Blythe, a frail spinster with no enemies but too many secrets, had seemed unremarkable, until the residue in her teacup suggested otherwise. Arsenic, subtle, deliberate. Marjorie had been the last living witness to the night Elias was condemned, and she had threatened in a letter to the vestry to reveal everything. But it was her own niece, Lenora, returned from the city with high ambitions and empty pockets, who had silenced her, not out of hatred, but a raw selfish fear that Marjorie's confession would unravel the quiet arrangement promising Lenora a sizable inheritance. She needed silence, not scandal, and in her mind, a cup of poisoned peace was easier than risking everything on the morality of strangers. When Miss Hart discovered the wooden keepsake box Julian had carried, a box wrapped in worn velvet and trembling hands, she opened it not with expectation, but with reverence, and found within a letter not written by Elias, but to him, from the woman he had loved and lost, Annalise Vexley, the very daughter of the man who'd condemned him, torn between blood and truth, had written Elias in secret, confessing everything, her father's plot, her own failure to speak, her torment, her cowardice. She had never sent it. The ink bled with tears decades old. It was too late to save Elias, but not too late to remember him rightly. Julian, holding that letter beneath the cathedral's cracked stained glass, did not weep, but Miss Hart saw the storm behind his stillness, the relief of knowing he had not come in vain. The truth had clawed its way from the earth, through grave silence, broken bones, and poisoned tea, until it stood bare and unashamed, in the cold light of justice, not the justice of courts, but of memory, of history reclaimed. Hawthorne Estate, long entombed in the silence of rotting memories and ivy-choked regrets, stood at the edge of the village, like an ancient sentinel, watchful, wounded, waiting. For decades, its towering frame loomed over the moorlands, its shutters sealed against both storm and truth, its garden left to thorns that clawed at its iron gates, as if trying to escape the very secrets buried within. The villagers dared only to speak of it in half-whispers, fearful of awakening whatever grief slept behind its walls. But it was a brittle silence, one destined to break. It began not with thunder, but with a hollow creak, an accidental push against a warped floorboard in the dusty study, revealing a hidden compartment inside the base of an old writing desk. There, among moth-eaten papers and forgotten trinkets, lay a letter sealed with wax long melted and ink now faded into the color of dried blood. The hands that had written it had trembled with guilt, not fear. Eleanor Winter, once a quiet observer of her family's fall from grace, now an elderly woman whose eyes carried both storms and sunsets, read the words as though peeling away the layers of her own soul. The truth revealed within it was simple but devastating. The crime that had condemned her cousin Thomas Hale had not been his at all. The guilt belonged elsewhere to someone shielded by influence and protected by silence. That silence had festered like rot beneath polished floors, infecting generations. She held the letter not as a weapon, but as a reckoning. Rowan Hale, a man burdened not by actions of his own, but by the specter of a stained lineage, returned to the manor not to claim inheritance, but to seek the origin of the ache that had always lived inside him. He walked its hollow corridors not with greed, but with reverence, listening to every creak as if the house itself were speaking. Outside, the garden had grown wild and cruel in its abandonment, the hedges like barricades and the trees heavy with memories. Slowly, Rowan cleared the thorns with bare hands, not pruning but healing. The villagers watched from afar, uncertain, as the iron gates once locked to all swung open on freshly oiled hinges, inviting not intrusion, but understanding. And it was in the center of that haunted earth, beside a cracked sundial, that had long kept vigil over time and torment, that Eleanor chose to kneel. Her fingers, fragile but firm, dug into the same soil, where decades earlier she had buried the silver spoon, evidence of a betrayal she once chose to protect. But today, instead of hiding guilt, she planted heather, humble, enduring and defiantly alive. Each bloom a word unsaid, each root a thread of forgiveness twisting through the bones of the past. The manor, brick by brick, began to breathe again, not as the house of ghosts, but as a place of mourning transformed into remembrance. Inside, with rain tapping softly at the glass, Eleanor sat with the village rector. His tone was careful, inquisitive. "Do you believe justice has finally been done?" he asked, eyes searching hers for something clean. Eleanor, gazing out the window where the first blossoms dared to rise, replied softly, "Justice is not about what is lost or gained, it is about what is no longer hidden. It is not the punishing of the guilty, but the freeing of the truth." Her voice carried not certainty, but peace. And truth, like a rose, cannot bloom in darkness. It needs light, even if that light comes late. Outside, Rowan stood still, watching the wind play with the petals, the house behind him no longer heavy with sorrow, but alive with the quiet murmurs of change. The children of the village, who once crossed the road to avoid even glancing at Hawthorne, now ran freely along its paths, their laughter softening old echoes. The past had not been erased, but it had been named, faced, and finally allowed to rest. And in that stillness, in the warm breath of dusk as the sun dipped behind the hills, the house exhaled, its burdens lifted, its truth spoken, its shadows no longer prisons, but lessons. In the language of broken things made whole, the garden bloomed not for beauty, but for memory, for the lives bent beneath silence, and for the quiet stubborn mercy that dared to grow from it. There was something unsettling about the way Waverley Hollow breathed that winter, like the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for something it had buried long ago to claw its way back to the surface. The fog rolled in heavier than usual, curling through the hedgerows, and whispering along the cobbled lanes with secrets it had kept for decades. At the far edge of the village green, the Holloway house, shrouded in ivy and silence, its windows darkened by more than just time, stood like a forgotten sentinel of sorrow. For years, children crossed the street to avoid it, and old men avoided its name like a curse. But when Abigail Linley, the reserved librarian, known more for her quiet presence than her past, returned unexpectedly to claim the deed after her great-aunt's passing, the ground beneath Waverley Hollow seemed to shift. She hadn't come seeking history, she came to escape her own. But destiny, it seemed, had other plans. It started with the creak of a floorboard in the nursery, a loose plank under the faded rug, revealing a hidden cavity. Inside, bound in a blue ribbon dulled by age and dust, lay a child's diary, pages filled not with innocent tales of play, but with fragmented drawings and cryptic lines. "He stands in the mirror, but casts no shadow. She cries when the candle burns out. They told me not to write this." Abigail's breath caught. The name signed at the bottom matched that of a child believed to have vanished in 1952, her grandmother's sister, long thought to have drowned in the lake behind the estate. But there had never been a body. As Abigail pored through the entries, her chest tightened with every line, every sketch that seemed to bleed fear. When she took the diary to Reverend Alcott, a man who had served the village for nearly 5 decades, and whose eyes flickered with something deeper than surprise, his hands trembled as he turned the pages. "And forgiveness?" he asked, barely above a whisper, as though the word itself might shatter something. Abigail didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the stained glass behind the altar, where the sun caught the image of a weeping angel. "Forgiveness," she said, "isn't owed, it's earned. And some never even ask." In the days that followed, Waverley Hollow returned to its delicate rhythms, fresh loaves at the bakery, morning bells, polite nods at the market, but something had shifted. People whispered more quietly, eyes lingered a moment longer, and the silence between greetings grew heavier. The postmistress no longer chuckled when the Holloway name was spoken. The schoolteacher stopped telling children the old ghost stories. No one said it outright, but they all felt it. The past had stirred. Abigail, now spending her evenings in the once abandoned drawing room, found herself tracing her fingers over the cracks in the fireplace bricks, wondering how many secrets had been absorbed into these walls. She discovered a locket behind the bookshelf, inside of which was a portrait, her grandmother as a child, and beside her, a girl who bore the same fearful eyes as those drawn in the diary. On the back, for Clara, "Remember me when the music stops." Abigail wept, not out of sorrow alone, but because the truth had always been there, just waiting for someone to look. She realized then that secrets are not just hidden, they are passed down, tucked inside heirlooms, silences, and bedtime lies. And yet, the truth, unwelcome as it may be, has a way of finding the light. The child had not drowned, she had been hidden, her cries dismissed, her pain wrapped in shame and shadow. The Holloways, pillars of respectability, had buried her story to protect their name. But now, through ink and instinct, Abigail had returned her to the world. Justice hadn't come with police tape or public trials. It had come in a diary, in a locket, in a knowing silence broken by one woman's refusal to turn away. As Abigail sipped her now cold tea that night, she understood, sometimes the past doesn't need to be rewritten, it just needs to be read. And with that, the village, though seemingly unchanged, would never be the same. So we ask you, if you were in Abigail's place, would you have opened that floorboard? Would you have chased ghosts through ink and memory, even knowing what it might, or would you, like so many before, have let the silence settle once more? Let us know in the comments below. Your thoughts breathe new life into stories long untold. And if this tale found its way into the corners of your heart, be sure to subscribe for more mysteries where the whispers of the past still echo through time. Share this with someone who understands that sometimes, the most terrifying truths are the ones we inherit. Until we meet again, keep your eyes open, and your ears to the ground, for in places like Waverly Hollow, even the dead don't rest without telling their story.